video I said that we were going to start right in on the Heroku deployment, but there's one more change we need to make before we can go to Heroku. And that is to set a database configuration file. Right now, the file, well, this is our, database, our SQLite database, the connects file. And right now, the file that interacts with this file directly, the only file that requires this in order to work is, if you recall, our database helpers, our queries that we wrote. So if we go over to that file, we're requiring connects, and then we're importing that connects file, and then we're saying run on the development environment. Once again, kind of like how we hard-coded the port, we hard-coded this file to work directly with connects. And that really isn't industry best practices. We need to create one more tiny small separation of concerns so that we create a file that will have, anytime a file needs to interact with, our database, then we need to have that file be the thing that is required in here instead of going directly to the connects file. What do I mean by that? Well, follow me. I am going to create a new file. I'm going to call it, this file, normally you can find it sometimes in the data folder or different folders. Just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to stick it in the root directory out here. So I'm going to create a file, and I'm going to call it dbconfig. It goes by different names. It can be config, or I've seen it named several different things, but this is the most common name that I see it named, dbconfig. And this file is going to be the file that interacts with our connects file. And then our DB helpers is going to interact with the dbconfig. And we're going to cause this separation of concerns so that, once again, our Heroku, we're going to set an environment variable in this dbconfig file here that'll tell it which configuration to use. Because if you recall, right now we have set up just a development environment. But in the next video, we're going to set up a production. We're going to add to this object a whole bunch of production for Postgres to be used by Heroku. And so that's going to be called production. And so how do our DB helpers here that interact directly with the database, how does it know which one to pick, development or production? And so we're going to do that and set it up in a way where it doesn't have to directly go to this file in order to do that. And so we're going to set up a dbconfig where we're going to say const dbengine, in other words, production or development. That's what this variable is going to be for. Equals, and if we set a value as an environment variable, .db environment, how about we call it that? Or if the value is not set in the env file, then use development. So when we go to Heroku, we're going to set a process env value called db environment, and we're going to make it equal to production. Right now, we don't need to add an env value of db environment to our. We could add db environment equals development to this file, but it's kind of redundant, since if we don't add this value at all, then it's going to simply default to development. If you recall from the last video, the env file does not get pushed up to GitHub, so it only it is only in effect either here in our local environment or in Heroku, we're going to set up a whole new env file there with values that pertain in particular to production. I know that sounds kind of confusing, but trust me, we do not need this here, because if we leave it out, we're going to just by default run in development. And then when we go to Heroku, we will set that value and we will call it production. And that way, when our server runs on Heroku, it knows to select the production object that we're going to create down here. So let me save that env file after making those changes. So right now, we're going to say equals that or development, and now we can use this, create a configuration object here. We're going to say const config equals require our connects file. So our connects file for right now, it's in the root directory, right? Yeah, it's right here in the root directory. You might have code bases where these files are stuck in other subfolders, but you just go find the file. Connects file, and then we're going to use bracket notation. So right now what this will say, this config variable will, since it's pointing to connects file, it's basically going to give us this entire object back. But we can tell it what part of this object that we want back. Once again, we're going to add on to this object we're going to add on to this outer object another object. Right now this object contains another object. We're going to add a production object to it. And so we can tell it which one to point to right now by using bracket notation. And we're going to use that, and we're going to have the value in here point to this value right here. So DB engine. So let me explain this again. Right now, if we don't set a process env value for DB environment, it will by default run in development mode, which works perfectly fine for our purpose while we're in development on our local machine. Once we deploy this to Heroku, we will set a value in Heroku's process env file. We will set a value here where we're going to set it equal to production. That way, when Heroku runs the server, it will look to this value, and then this part of the OR statement, which is first before this one, will pick up that value production, and it'll run it in production, and it'll stick either in this variable development or production. And then this variable we're going to pass to the connects file. So this value that we're passing will be smart. If we're running in our local development, then development will go in here. If we're running it on Heroku, then the word production will go in here. And then we simply have to export it. Module.exports equals require connects, and then we pass it, config, this value right here. This part right here is basically what we're doing in our helper files. If you look at it right here, it's basically doing the same thing right there. So now that we've created this DB configuration object, let me save it. We no longer need to interact with the connects file directly in our helpers. Let me comment those out for right now. We can simply just, require this new DB configuration object. So now we will say const, we have to call it DB because we call it DB there. So const DB equals require, and what is the name of the file? We call it dbconfig, this file right here. Oh, we got to go up a level, up one level, and then dbconfig. And so this is basically getting its connection to the database through this middle file instead of directly. Before we were going directly from the helpers right to the connects file. Now we're saying get your connection to the connects file through this file. And we need to create this file so we can create a way of being able to run either in development or production. And once we go to Heroku, I promise in the very next video, all of this will become much clearer. You'll see how in this file we set environment variables for our own needs here, but in Heroku we set in environment variables for that environment there. And so let me save all, and hopefully our server should spin up again, and it is. There we are. Everything is working again. And if just to prove that our configuration, to our helpers is still active, let's go to Insomnia, because now I just made a change here to connect to the database, not through these, but literally through this middle file. So let's go to Insomnia and let's do a get. And I was testing it on. Let's do a get. Our server's running on 5,000. And if I do a send, then look, I get a 200 OK. And let me get the lessons by ID. Let me change this to 5. And hit send, and we still get our messages. So our development mode is still properly connected because we haven't created a value here. And so this OR statement is going to run in development, which gets passed into this variable, and it'll pick right now. This is what's running right now. But in the next video, now we're going to create this object and with our new Postgres values. So I look forward to having you with me in the very next video.